I'm discouraged by his remark that he's been told it was a mistake. I mean, if that was a Russian mistake, then Russia's made an awful lot of them.
Let's talk about Russia and Ukraine. At least 34 people, including 2 children, were killed and over 100 injured in a Russian ballistic missile strike on the Ukrainian city of Sumy. The attack was on Palm Sunday. People were going to church. President Zelensky says only pressure and decisive action will bring Russia to the negotiating table. The Kremlin has yet to comment. This was Donald Trump's reaction on board Air Force One to the attack.
I think it was terrible, and I was told they made a mistake, but I think it's a horrible thing. I think the whole war is a horrible thing. I think the war is, for that war to have started, is an abuse of power. This country would have never allowed that war to have started if I were president.
Catherine, like 6 days ago, weren't we supposed to be on the verge of peace in Ukraine?
Well, yes, we have been on the verge of peace several times, according to Donald Trump. He clearly doesn't like war, and he doesn't like seeing these images or feeling that, he's not empowered to stop it. I mean, I do think that there is a personal sense of frustration there, that people are not just doing as he wishes they would and stopping it. I'm discouraged by his remark that he's been told it was a mistake. I mean, if that was a Russian mistake, then Russia's made an awful lot of them, because this was very, very clearly a civilian target in Sumy, a city that's close to the border with Russia. But I think what Trump is finding is that it's not as easy as he thought it looked, and that Russia is really not willing to give any quarter on anything other than a full deal. I mean, they've gone that far since originally attempting to sound a slightly more amenable. They're now saying, no ceasefire, no staged progression towards a full deal. It's a full deal or nothing. And I think we know what a full deal looks like to Russia, and it's utter capitulation for Ukraine and effectively a surrender.
Yeah, well, this morning EU ministers are meeting in Luxembourg, and Poland's foreign minister said that Vladimir Putin is mocking Donald Trump's goodwill by continuing to attack Ukraine. I mean, the mention of Donald Trump's goodwill, maybe a bit of what we call trolling there, I suppose. But the idea that that Putin's actions are starting to make Donald Trump look foolish, could that change? Could that change the American calculations? Could that change Trump's calculations? Or is there just nowhere else for them to go, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because I think that when I was in Ukraine in November, when Trump won re-election, there was a lot of, I expected people to be, more miserable than they were, but there was a lot of sort of rationalization of, well, Trump doesn't want to look weak, he doesn't want to look stupid, so he won't let Putin walk all over him. And then, of course, what subsequently happened with, what was said by Hegseth and the parameters of a peace deal laid out, people there got very gloomy because they realized that Trump was, in fact, appeared to be quite willing to give Putin almost everything he wanted. But he doesn't, he loses his patience, and he doesn't like looking stupid. He did walk away from talks with Kim Jong-un of North Korea when he realized that it was going nowhere. He enjoys the razzmatazz of an international summit, and he enjoys looking like, this player on the world stage and doing all this stuff. I think it's quite interesting that he hasn't yet had one of those meetings with Putin, and the fact that he's held off this long, it makes me wonder that he may have possibly learned something from the first time around, not to give too much up front. But I still think the chances of him simply losing patience with the whole thing is considerable.
Yeah, well, let's talk about one of the other pieces he's trying to bring about, which is the first round of talks in Iran's nuclear program over the weekend have been described as productive by both the US and by Tehran. They've agreed to more talks in a week's time. Lawrence Friedman, the war professor, wrote in the Sunday Times that it'd been better off if they'd just proceeded with the deal negotiated by Barack Obama. What's the argument there? In what sense is this a better deal? Is Trump just trying to avoid looking like he's doing anything that's in Obama's legacy?
I mean, my feelings are about why Trump, or my assessment of why Trump pulled out of that deal was basically that it was Obama's legacy and he couldn't really stand anything. He couldn't stand Obama leaving any foreign policy legacy that he would have to see through. So he cancelled it. I think his grave error was to walk out of that deal without anything in place. And it has left the world in a more dangerous place than it was in before, because whatever you thought of the deal, and there were many views of it, and it wasn't a good deal, it didn't take account of Iran's proxies in the region like Hezbollah, those kind of things. It was too narrowly focused on the nuclear issue. All that aside, Iran is far closer to the point of nuclear breakout now than it was under that deal. And that is why these talks are happening. But the fact that these talks are happening is possibly one of the most sensible things that the Trump White House has done since his inauguration. So I think we should cross our fingers on it.
So they're not the concerned parties. They're not in the same room. They're speaking through intermediaries at the moment, as we understand it. And Trump's reportedly sort of giving it 2 months with terrible threats of presumably military action in the offing if those 2 months pass without any kind of deal. I mean, should we take him seriously on this one? Because he does make these threats, Donald Trump, but it is quite hard. I mean, he's bombed Yemen, but it's quite hard to envisage him embarking on a full-scale military action against Iran, isn't it? And the Iranians will think that too, I'd have thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty easy to bomb Yemen and it not make very much, noise or headlines. There's no one in Yemen to cover it. Essentially, it's such an undercovered crisis. You don't hear much about it. If there were bombing of Iran, we would hear a lot about it, and it would be hugely disruptive in the region, and it probably wouldn't be successful. And I think that was a point that Friedman made as well, that that Iran's nuclear facilities are pretty well buried out of reach of most of the weaponry that could be deployed against them. I don't see Trump bombing Iran. I think that if there were to be military action, it might be in the form of giving Israel a pass to do so. But again, we don't know, if Netanyahu's belligerence towards Iran is at the point of actually starting a war on another front while it's still got stuff going on closer to home.
But look, the big story, of course, is the status of British steel following the government's bailout. We're trying to get our heads around basically the China's role here. Questions are being asked whether Beijing was deliberately trying to undermine the steel industry. Should we understand this, do you think? I mean, just in general terms, is this the kind of thing that China does on a sort of on a geopolitical level, or is this just commercial interests that are based in China that don't care about British commercial interests and thus cost us?
Well, I think it's important to note that there's really nothing, there's no such thing in China as a private company. I've heard some people try and describe this as a private company. They don't really exist. All private companies have a kind of official loyalty to the state, whereby they have to act in the state's interest. It would be entirely consistent with Chinese behavior elsewhere in the world, and certainly at a time when this trade war is really exploding between China and the US, and it's the only place that hasn't seen a pause on these massive tariffs. It would make a lot of sense if China were to make sure that other countries were not in a position to start that kind of trade war with them, and that they might need things that China can export. But part of this is one other part of this that interests me is that on a broader scale is that Donald Trump has launched this trade war against China in particular, in the world more generally, without securing some of the flows of critical supplies that he needs. Now, in the case of the UK, this is about, whether we have the ability to produce our own raw steel. In the case of the US, it's things like, these rare earth minerals that we've heard so much about that he wants Greenland for and stuff. And by complicating trade with China, you've complicated your ability to get hold of some of those things. So I think this is all tied up in the same machinations we're seeing, which is about supply lines around the world being thrown into chaos by what Trump has done.
Well, I mean, the fact that the sort of the back and forth just to turn to Trump a minute away from China, the back and forth we've seen from the Americans over the last couple of days over whether there are going to be exclusions for electronics import from China or not, what products are going to be facing the 145% charges. The fact that he seems to have reversed on smartphones and computers. Then this morning he's saying actually in the future they are going to go back to putting tariffs on smartphones and computers. I mean, it's like he's just sort of woken up and realized that America can't make these things for themselves.
Indeed. I don't know if you've seen the slew of memes coming out from China of Trump himself and other Americans scratching their heads over factory supply lines trying to put together iPhones, and the Chinese laughing about how they would suddenly be able to assemble these things they've never done before. I think it was Tim Cook who made a very apposite intervention when he said that the price under those tariffs, the price of an iPhone would go up to over $3,000 with those tariffs, which is an absolutely extraordinary way to hit the ordinary American people in their pocket. You know, that's not something that would be hurting China as much as it would be hurting American customers, and indeed one of the US's most valuable companies. So yeah, there's a lot that has not been thought through, and I mean, who knows? As you say, he obviously reacted to that prediction about the price of an iPhone tripling, and made one statement and has now gone back on it, presumably because he believes that somehow he can re-onshore that production. But I don't think anyone thinks that most of these things that Trump is angry about, the fact that they're being made overseas, I don't think that any of them are likely to be made in the US while he's still president, because it just takes so long to do these things.
Just turning back to China briefly, Xi Jinping, we understand, is in Vietnam today, starting a tour of Asian countries that are going to be hit by Trump's tariffs, assuming they come back. Tell us a bit about what China is hoping to achieve in doing this. Are they trying to expand their influence in their own backyard? Basically, has Donald Trump given them an opportunity to do so?
He absolutely has, yes. I happened to be on holiday in Cambodia when those tariffs were introduced, and Cambodia was hit with the highest one. So I felt compelled to put my reporting hat on and do a bit of work on that. And Cambodia is one of those countries that has come in very much into China's orbit and has taken on a lot of the manufacturing that people have tried to move elsewhere to get away from, the threat of tariffs and that kind of thing. Vietnam is another country, but that has taken on a lot of that manufacturing, but has a much more fractious relationship with China. And what people in the region were telling me, economists, were saying that they couldn't imagine a more successful way that you could drive countries like this, like Vietnam, who are on the fence a bit, to actually have a closer relationship with Russia than with China and have historical difficulties. But really, you couldn't think of a quicker way to force them into China's grip. So it seems that that's exactly what Xi is doing. He's going around the region and, sort of making common cause with all these people over how very nasty the Americans are to them. And I think it's to be seen whether this will last. But one of the very first, very peculiar acts of solidarity we saw in that region of the world after the tariffs were slapped on was a deal between Japan, South Korea, and China over trade. Now, those are two stalwart American allies in the Far East, and that was the effect that Trump's tariffs had.